one person with no illusions about Oswald's role launched his own investigation into the Kennedy assassination in 1967. The former district attorney of New Orleans, Judge Jim Garrison.
He was employed by the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was obviously drawn into a scapegoat situation and made to believe ultimately that he was penetrating the assassination. And then when the time came, they took the scapegoat, the man who thought he was working for the United States government, and killed him real quick. And then the machinery, disinformation machinery started turning, and they started making a villain out of a man who genuinely was probably a hero.
6 months before the assassination, Oswald had taken a mundane job with the Riley Coffee Company, but it seems his real activities were centered a few blocks away. From a small office on the corner of Lafayette and Camp Street, Oswald managed a local chapter of the pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Operating from an adjoining office was a sinister figure named Guy Bannister.
About Guy Bannister, it's difficult to say much about him because he always stood in the shadows and pushed someone else to the front. He was a strongly disciplined man, perhaps the outgrowth of his many years as a special agent in charge of the Chicago office of the FBI. But he was a key man in the assassination. And that's clear from the fact that Oswald's sheep-dipping, his being portrayed as a communist, was done out of Guy Bannister's office. So he was sheep-dipped for months as a communist by given literature. Lee, hand this out today. This is your assignment. I came across the fact that Oswald, a private in the Marines, had taken a Russian examination. And I knew the privates did not take Russian examinations unless they were connected with intelligence. So that caused me to be curious about 544 Camp, which was the address stamped on one circular that they gave out one time before, obviously, Bannister told him, Lee, no more addresses. It turned out that was a side address of Guy Bannister's private detective agency. Well, I went down there to look at it, and I found myself not merely outside of Guy Bannister's office, but across the street from Naval Intelligence, across the street from Secret Service. Around the corner was the Crescent City garage, the garage for the intelligence community. And then 2 doors away, the Riley Coffee Company. I used to be in the FBI. I knew people in Naval Intelligence, and they were either across the street, around the corner. The whole intelligence community was there, and right in the middle of it was Guy Bannister having Oswald sheep-dipped as a communist. When the president ends up being assassinated and the scapegoat grabbed by the federal government and killed before anything can be done to help him, turns out to be the man that Guy Bannister has been the tutor of all the time, you have to conclude that Guy Bannister was a key man in the assassination and possibly the most important man that we encountered in our whole investigation. But he's been dead so many years, it's a little hard to question.
One of the most important facts that backs up what Garrison is saying is that there was absolutely no witnesses or direct evidence to prove that Oswald killed the president and Officer Tippit. No witnesses saw Oswald on the 6th floor, and in fact, Oswald was seen in the depository lunchroom by Dallas police just moments after the shooting, as they had entered into the building just 90 seconds afterwards. Oswald could never have pulled that off, and with no witnesses and nothing but tampered and excusable evidence, Oswald must have been the patsy, set up so that the CIA, FBI, and all the new powers coming into the picture could continue the manipulation of the government and the people who support it.
If the head of the FBI and the head of the Secret Service and key lieutenants of those two figures are involved in covering up, plus the President of the United States and all his cronies, you don't need a massive conspiracy to get away with this.
After the assassination, Cliff Carter, Johnson's aide, made repeated calls from the White House to the district attorney in Dallas, Henry Wade. He was instructed to look no further than Oswald for the guilty man. There was no conspiracy. A similar call was made to the Attorney General of Texas, Wagner Carr.
Then we have Lyndon Johnson himself calling the chief of homicide, Will Fritz, who's really doing the dirt work as far as interrogating Oswald and trying to get to the bottom of this case. He calls him and tells him, you have your man. You have your man. Let it go at that. Lyndon Johnson is trying to control what is going on with the investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy from Washington, D.C., with crucial figures in the case.
The late Dr. Charles Crenshaw experienced the new president's controlling hand. He was in the operating theatre at Parkland Hospital with his colleagues, working to save Oswald's life after Jack Ruby had shot him. He was urgently called to the phone in an adjoining office.
I picked up the phone, and it was there I heard this voice like thunder that stated, "This is the president, Lyndon B. Johnson." And he asked, "How is the accused assassin doing?" I was so startled. The thing that I could say was, he's holding his own. He's lost a large amount of blood. He said, "Would you take a message to the chief operating surgeon?" It was more of an order than a question. So I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "There is a man in the room. I would like for him to take a deathbed confession." And all of a sudden, the phone went off. I returned to the operating room. I tapped Dr. Shires on the shoulder. He looked at me like, "What are you talking about?" Everyone was working feverishly in the abdomen trying to correct the wounds there. I said, "Guess who I've been talking to?" I said, "The President of the United States called and wants that man over there to take a deathbed confession." And Shires looked at me like I was crazy, and we both realized that there was no way Lee Harvey Oswald, had he survived, would have been able to give any testimony until 2 or 3 days after the procedure. But still in all, the president had called, and I did relay the message.
When Dr. Crenshaw published his story in 1992, he suffered an avalanche of criticism. It was argued that Johnson made no such call. Crenshaw's critics were proved wrong by a former chief switchboard operator at Parkland Hospital, Phyllis Bartlett.
The call came in and said, "Hold the line for the president." And for a second, I couldn't, I was still thinking Kennedy, and I was kind of taken back for a minute, and then in a few seconds, it was just a matter of a second, he came on in a loud voice. He said, "This is Lyndon Johnson. Connect me to the accused assassin's doctor." It sounded the same as it had been on newscasts when I would hear him speak. I knew I had put a call to the operating room, so I contacted Dr. Crenshaw, and I told him, that I knew he did get the call, and that I was sorry that the people had, in the newspaper and on the TVs, had tried to discredit him. And that was when I spoke out.
From the moment he became president, Johnson had authority over every aspect of the cover-up of Kennedy's murder. He was unassailable.
Johnson has the power to contain the investigation, both nationally and locally, on the ground in Texas.
And I believe that there could very well be an understanding of the good people of this country that he went into Dallas knowing full well everything that had happened to Ambassador Stevenson, and still insisted that it was his duty to go there. He was brave enough and determined enough to go there, and finally was determined that that bubble should not be put on top of the cup. I don't see how anyone can ignore that. And I believe that people do realize, regardless of what their ambitions are or what their policies are, that here was a man that to the bitter end courageously stood up for what he considered to be right, whether you look at it from the world picture of peace or whether you look at it for inherent decency within the country.
Of course, this is not an isolated event in American history. I think it's one of the stains on our star-crossed history that among the great civilized nations of the world, the assassination of a chief executive happens more often in this country than anywhere else. Now, why is that? An event like this has been a profound shock to everyone in this country. Is it possible that President Johnson's task may be made easier as a result of this shock by the introduction of a sense of reality and importance into the sometimes romanticized aspects of American politics? Mr. Heilbrunner.
I was, like many other people, brooding about that very question last night when I couldn't sleep well. And I recalled something that struck me very much at the time when I first read a passage in Disraeli's novel Sybil, in which he discusses the war between the two nations. And someone in the novel, I forget who, naively asks who the two nations are, and Disraeli says the rich and the poor, the two nations that war in every country.
It's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it. The people.
The councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
President Eisenhower warned the nation of the dangers of the military-industrial complex. A permanent war economy was their business, with billions at stake.
Would you give us your appraisal of the situation in South Vietnam now since the coup and the purposes for the Honolulu conference?
Well, because we do have a new situation and a new government. We attempt to assess the situation, what American policy should be, what our aid policy should be, how we can intensify the struggle, how we can bring Americans out of there. Now, that is our object.
The people who didn't want John Kennedy to be president were those who were making incredible fortunes from war production.
Had Kennedy lived, I think we'd have had no Vietnam War with all of its traumatic and divisive influences in America. I think we would have escaped that. I think the world would have escaped. The 50,000 odd Americans dead and 300,000 more wounded and over 500,000 more hooked on dangerous drugs and tropical diseases. The divisiveness of that war that so many of the people thought unjustified and unnecessary and it shouldn't have been there. It split this country widely, and many of those things have lingered on since.
If it hadn't been for the kookiest of all, the radio talk shows, we critics would not have been able to reach the people we did, and they were very important. The Washington Post resisted it, the New York Times resisted it, the major TV networks resisted it, unless you had something nutty, unless you had something dramatic, unless you had something they knew wasn't true. But substantial criticism never had a voice. And that's what the working of a democratic society requires. Most of all, when it's a crime of the magnitude of the subversiveness of this one, the assassination of a president.
If the press would just open their eyes, if the media would accept the fact of the conspiracy, instead of just arbitrarily disbelieving, we'd have some allies. A handful of critics and researchers in this case have gotten remarkably far on their own. But if the press would just be honest about it and question and do their job, we could learn a lot more. The fact of the assassination conspiracy is beyond doubt. Only the scope is in question.
I'm a first-generation American. I'm the first member of my family born at least since the time of Christ. I can't go back to Adam. In freedom. None of my predecessors ever had it. And I've been a writer, an investigator, reporter, a Senate investigator, an intelligence analyst. And the older I get, the more convinced I become that despite all its failings, we have the best system of self-government man has yet perfected. And it's got so many failings. But for the system to work, those who are responsible for seeing to it that it works have to see to it that it works. In this case, didn't happen. They subverted it instead. The assassination nullified our system, and the investigation nullified our system. My investigation has been different than that of others who are known as critics, because mine is a study of how the institutions of our society worked at the time of Great Crisis and since then. And obviously, the conclusion's obvious. They all failed. All, on all levels.